Bill Clinton was an extraordinarily able commander-in-chief. By the way, at the same time we attacked Saddam Hussein, we finished off the remnants of his weapons of mass destruction program in December of 1998. We did strike at Osama bin Laden, and probably Clinton, as he said on television the other night, he probably tried a half dozen times to take out Osama bin Laden. He failed to do that. But he tried, and he warned George Bush when he came to office what the real threat to America was. It wasn't China. It wasn't North Korean missiles. We didn't need to make the top priority a theater missile and national missile defense program. What we needed to do, and Clinton and his team told this to the incoming administration, we needed to focus on the threat from Osama bin Laden. The warning was given, and it was ignored by George W. Bush. He was asleep at the switch. He didn't call meetings. He didn't produce a national strategy. He didn't alert the Allies. He didn't do a thing extraordinary. You know, in the United States Navy, when you're the commander of an aircraft carrier and you're docking in San Francisco and it's got some pretty strong currents and you don't do anything extraordinary, you just sort of let the aircraft carrier drift and it runs aground, they don't even do an investigation. They don't care if you're on the bridge, asleep in your stateroom, or on leave in Kansas. You're fired. You're derelict in duty. Our president didn't do enough before 9/11. Ladies and gentlemen, he was derelict in his duties as commander-in-chief. They used 9/11 as a pretext to embark on this cockamamie notion of invading a bunch of countries in the Middle East to change their governments. They used the weapons of mass destruction as an excuse. Let me tell you, in 1991, when I was a one-star general at the National Training Center, I had to go back to Washington on a visit, and I paid a courtesy call on Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, and then went upstairs and paid a courtesy call on Undersecretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz. 1991. I said, Mr. Secretary, congratulations on the Gulf War. He said, well, thanks, but not really. He said, because we let Saddam Hussein get away. I didn't say anything. I wasn't in the Gulf War. I was in Fort Irwin, California, as a commanding general of the National Training Center. Wolfowitz said, some people think that Saddam's going to be overthrown. He said, I know, he said, our president thinks that. He said, but I don't think so. He says, in fact, we failed. He said, but we've got a window. We learned that the Soviets won't use force against us when we use force. We can now use our military, he said, and we've got a window, an opportunity of 5, 10 years, maybe more. Go into the Middle East in force and clean out these old Soviet client states, these Soviet surrogate regimes like Iraq and Syria, before the next great superpower comes along, and bring the Middle East over to our side. I listened to him. I just said sort of, oh, yes, sir, thank you, and walked out. I got to get a glass of water.
Extensive scientific research has demonstrated that on an average day in June, the average human brain is capable of remembering at most one thought from a commencement speech. But since today is cooler than average, and West Pointers are definitely above average, I will challenge you to think this morning about two words: surprise and courage. This year marks the 60th anniversary of a military disaster whose name has become synonymous with surprise: the attack on Pearl Harbor. Interestingly, that surprise attack was preceded by an astonishing number of unheeded warnings and missed signals. Intelligence reports warned of a surprise move in any direction, but this made the Army commander in Honolulu think of sabotage, not attack. People were reading newspapers in Hawaii which cited promising reports about intensive Japanese diplomatic efforts, unaware that these were merely a charade. An ultra-secret code-breaking operation, one of the most remarkable achievements in American intelligence history, an operation called Magic, had unlocked the most private Japanese communications. But the operation was considered so secret and so vulnerable to compromise that the distribution of its product was restricted to the point that our field commanders didn't make the need-to-know list. And at 7 a.m. on December 7th, at Opana Radar Station, two privates detected what they called something completely out of the ordinary. In fact, it was so out of the ordinary that the inexperienced watch officer assumed it must be friendly airplanes and told them just forget about it. Yet military history is full of surprises, even if few are as dramatic or as memorable as Pearl Harbor. Surprise happens so often that it's surprising that we're still surprised by it. Very few of these surprises are the product of simple blindness or simple stupidity. Almost always there have been warnings and signals that have been missed, sometimes because there were just too many warnings to pick the right one out, sometimes because of what one scholar of Pearl Harbor called a poverty of expectations, a routine obsession with a few familiar dangers. This expectation of the familiar has gotten whole governments, sometimes whole societies, into trouble. At the beginning of the last century, the British economist Norman Angell published a runaway bestseller that must have drawn the attention of professors and cadets of West Point at that time. Angell argued that the idea that nations could profit from war was obsolete, that it had become, as he titled his book, The Great Illusion. International finance, he argued, had become so interdependent and so interwoven with trade and industry that it had rendered war unprofitable. One of Angell's disciples, David Starr Jordan, the president of an obscure institution on the West Coast called Stanford University, argued that war in Europe, though much threatened, would never come. The bankers, he said, will not find the money for such a fight. The industries will not maintain it. The statesmen cannot. There will be no general war. Unfortunately for him, he made that prediction in 1913. 1 year later, Archduke Franz Ferdinand fell to an assassin's bullet, plunging Europe into a war more terrible than any that had come before it. The notion of the Great Illusion yielded to the reality of the Great War. 100 years later, we live, once again, in a time of great hopes for world peace and prosperity. Our chances of realizing those hopes will be greater if we use the benefit of hindsight to replace a poverty of expectations with an anticipation of the unfamiliar and the unlikely. By doing so...
Yeah, thanks. So I thought to myself, well, that's certainly a strategic nugget. Think of that. We're going to embark on a campaign of cleaning up the cleaning up the Middle East by invading countries, knocking off their governments, taking over. Goodness gracious. I walked out of the office in 1991, and it was like a time warp. That's what they did after 9/11. They put the plan in place. I was in the Joint Chiefs of Staff 10 days after 9/11. And a 3-star general said to me, "Sir, come into my office." I said, "No, you're too busy." He said, "Sir, come in. Close the door." He said, "I have to tell you this." He said, "We're going to invade Iraq." This is 10 days after 9/11. I said, "Why? Did they find some kind of linkage with Saddam Hussein?" He said, "No, sir." He said, "I don't know why." He said, "I guess they don't know what to do about terrorism. But they know that the army we can invade Iraq and take down his government." He said, "I guess it's like the old saw, you know, if the only tool you got's a hammer, then every problem has to look like a nail." I came back about 6 weeks later. I didn't want to, you know, overstay my welcome in the Pentagon as a retired officer. And we were at that time bombing in Afghanistan. I went back to see the same general. I said, "So tell me," I said, "are we still going to go into Iraq?" He said, "Oh, sir, it's worse than that." He picked up a piece of paper on his desk. He said, this is a memo I just got from the 3rd floor meeting, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, that outlines a 5-year campaign strategy. We're going to go first into Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and then Iran. 5 years, 7 countries. I said, "Is that classified?" He said, "Oh, yes, sir." I said, "Then don't show it to me." Ladies and gentlemen, they've lied to us.
And now a newsmaker interview with the Deputy Secretary of State, Paul Wolfowitz. It will be conducted by Margaret Warner.
And Mr. Wolfowitz is the #2 man at the Pentagon. He also served in the Defense Department during the first Bush administration and played a major role in planning the Gulf War. Welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Nice to be here.
First, our condolences on your losses at the Pentagon.
Appreciate that. It's pretty grim.
Let's start with the news today, the President authorizing the Pentagon to call up to 50,000 reservists for homeland defense, he said. What are they needed for?
A variety of things. Perhaps the most important, and I think in greatest in numbers, is mobilizing Air National Guard units so that we can maintain air defense protection over the country, and particularly over crucial locations, major cities. We're going to have, I think, significant draw on the National Guard and Reserve in helping to deal with the colossal tragedy in New York City, everything from mortuary services to helping the New York authorities in the various municipal functions. That's basically the kind of thing we're talking about.
How many U.S. cities, there have been conflicting reports on this, are being protected essentially by this stepped-up surveillance?
I don't want to give a number, but the fact is we have capability to respond very quickly if there were another incident reported. We responded awfully quickly, I might say, on Tuesday, and in fact we were already tracking in on that plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. I think it was the heroism of the passengers on board that brought it down, but the Air Force was in a position to do so if we had had to.
What were the rules of engagement? Would they have allowed the Air Force to shoot down a civilian jetliner if it had appeared headed for a target?
I think, again, I don't want to get into rules of engagement, but I think it was pretty clear at that point that that airliner was not under the pilot's control and that it was heading to do major damage. And ultimately, it's the President's decision on whether to take an action as fateful as that. But thankfully, I mean, we really have to say what an incredible thing. And there's been so many great Americans doing great things, and the people on that plane are clearly among them.
Does the U.S. government have reason to believe that some terrorists, members of perhaps this same group or affiliated with them, are still in the United States and are still intending violent acts against Americans?
I think we have to operate on the assumption that there may still be people from that group in this country. I think we have to operate on the assumption that we haven't seen the end of this kind of terrorism. But we also have to, I think, understand that what we saw on Tuesday completely transforms the problem. We've got to think anew about this. The policies of the last 20 years, whether you think they were carried out effectively or ineffectively, obviously don't work. This is not going to be a problem solved by locking somebody up and putting them in jail. It's not going to be solved by some limited military action. It's going to take, as the President has said and Secretary Rumsfeld has said, a broad and sustained campaign against the terrorist networks and the states that support those terrorist networks.
Secretary Rumsfeld and the President have both used essentially the same term, the 21st century battlefield, a war of the 21st century. From where you sit, the military side of that, what is that war going to look like?
Well, first of all, it has to involve more than the military. And when we talk about the full resources of the nation, we mean obviously our military resources, which are awesome and can be made even more awesome. We're talking about our intelligence capabilities, which are impressive and can be made more impressive. But we're also talking about our economic strength. We're talking about our diplomatic strength. We're talking, I think the most important weapon we have is the political will of this country. And I think we'll find, once again, as has happened before in history, that evil people, because of the way they think, misread our system as one that's weak, that can't take casualties, can't take bloodletting, can't carry out a sustained operation. Hitler made that mistake. The Japanese made that mistake. It looks like the people on Tuesday made that mistake.
They haven't told us the truth. They didn't level with the American people before we went into Iraq. They haven't leveled with us about the difficulties that are there. They've been incompetent. Didn't put enough troops in. Didn't have the right mission. Didn't plan for what was going to happen afterwards. They've starved Afghanistan for resources where we could have achieved success, and now we're in a failing mission there. They actually believe that the major obstacle to success in Iraq is the American people. Can you imagine? They think we're the obstacle to success. If they can just keep us from knowing the truth, they think they can win. It's the most cockamamie, crazy, undemocratic notion I've ever heard in 38 years of following national security. They don't deserve to be in office, and we are going to throw them out starting in this election in 2006. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to do this.
Paul Wolfowitz, you have been consistently in favor of democracy and openness in the Arab world. You have criticized Arab dictatorships. Many people think you were one of the brains, if not the brain, behind George W. Bush's freedom agenda. Many conservatives, many of your fellow conservatives were and are very critical and really believe that the Arab Spring has been a terrible thing for the United States, for our interests, for Israel. How do you look at what has just happened?
Fareed, I think, first of all, I've said many times the Arab Spring could easily be followed by an Arab winter, and those seasonal terms don't help very much. It's a massive upheaval. It's not the product of something George Bush did. It's the product of decades of suppression and repression by these dictatorships that didn't even allow the modicum of civil society to develop. It did develop, for example, in Indonesia, or I think is happening in Morocco. That's the key ingredient here. But to turn to Libya, I think what we're seeing there, and the only thing I would absolutely agree with what Bernard-Henri Lévy said about Ambassador Stevens. He was a fantastic man who really was advancing American interests and Libyan interests, and his death is an enormous loss. I would just disagree. The people who killed him weren't imbeciles. They were doing it very deliberately, precisely to damage Libya. We don't really know yet who was behind it, but I think it's very clear these are some combination of forces that want to disrupt the progress Libya has made.